on his presentation of leveraging test-driven development, TDD, with FHIR implementations. Richard, take it away.
All right, thank you, Lynn. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Richard Ettema, and we're going to be talking about test-driven development with FHIR implementations. A little bit about my background. I work for Aegis, and I am the lead architect and developer for our Touchstone FHIR testing platform, HL7 FHIR proficient, and just recently got my HL7 certified educator badge. Woohoo! I've been doing this for a long time, but most recently, the last almost 20 years in health IT, and the last 9 years next month doing FHIR with a focus on testing. I am also the author of our Aegis Wildfire public test servers and clients. So today, what we want to take a look at is understanding test-driven development with FHIR. So we want to see what it is to use TDD to help accelerate our FHIR implementations. Also take a look at the importance of FHIR validation testing, looking at those interoperability challenges that we face, as well as what I call the 5 W's of testing. And then we're going to do a brief flyover of the FHIR specification where we actually have a testing framework definition inside the spec, and then close out with a little brief discussion on some of the FHIR testing programs at scale, 2 of which we have here in the US, ONC G10 certification, and with Drummond, we have certification for the CMS guidelines, and they follow the DaVinci HL7 FHIR Accelerator Program IGs. Now, before I actually get into the presentation, this is about test-driven development. And so since I know Touchstone as the platform very well, I am going to drop into Touchstone. And let me just pump up the volume here a little bit so we can see what we're doing. And let me sign in. And I'm going to sign in using our demo account. And I'm going to go to what we call our conformance suites interface. And what I have here is essentially a collection of test definitions, test scripts that we've gathered together to form a suite based on requirements of some sort. In this case, it's really just a suite of basic test scripts that exercise a FHIR server's basic conformance to the FHIR API, read, create, update, and so forth. Now I'm going to be testing my Wildfire public server using this suite, and you can see right now I'm at 87% conformant. This is a public server, so everybody gets to play around with it, so I'm not quite sure who's been playing with it, but I can see that the latest test executions show that I've got a little bit of red, and I actually have some white there, which means I haven't actually executed those particular tests. We can focus in on various slices of the pie if we want to, but I'm going to just click on the center, which means everything. So the entire suite of probably 170, 180 test scripts, each test averaging about 5 tests. And so I'm going to just kick that off by selecting all of them. And I think I bumped up the volume too much because we have the, there it is. So execute selected, okay? So I'm going to wait for that to gather all of that information together and start the test execution. So it's refreshed. And let me just, there we go. So it's going to keep refreshing like this in the background. So I'm going to minimize this. And essentially, when I get done talking through the rest of the presentation, we'll come back and take a look at our results. So I just want to show what it's like just to kick off a suite of tests and then come back and be able to look at those results. Hopefully I'll be all green by the end of it, but we'll see. So now our first section here is on understanding TDD with FHIR. So when we talk about TDD, test-driven development is what we're talking about. But there's a lot of different ways to define TDD, and this is one that I like from IBM. TDD is all about satisfying your team that the code works as expected for a behavior or use case. It's all about satisfying your team that the code works as expected for a behavior or use case. As I said, this is one of many definitions, and so there's a lot of opinions about TDD. Got to write the tests before you code. No, you have to do it this way. Or unit tests, it's all about unit tests, right? Everybody has an opinion. What I'd like to do is kind of take a pragmatic definition here, and let's talk about it this way. TDD is a way to accelerate FHIR implementations by testing during development. So a little tweak on TDD there, rather than waiting until development is done. So when we talk about TDD with FHIR implementations, there's something common that we want to get to, and that's really efficiency. TDD should make our FHIR implementation efforts go faster. There should be a return on investment with testing and TDD. So when we talk about this even more, we want to be light on the dogma. Let's not get into, hey, I've got a better definition than you, but we really want to focus on the efficiencies that we're going to get out of using TDD. So when we implement a feature, we want to be able to run an already written test and then refine based on the test results. And that refinement, typically we think of as, okay, I had some failures, I got to go back and fix something, or maybe I haven't implemented something yet and now I have to implement it. But it could go the other way too, right? Our test definition may also need to be refined. And so it's a back and a forth, if you will, to a large degree. But when we think about this, we want to be able to make sure we're fixing our bugs during development, because it's a lot faster than waiting until the end when we, basically throw it over the wall to the QA team, right? Now, we want to be able to do this testing during the development cycles. So the secret sauce here is keep running the tests. Catch those regressions while the code is still fresh in our mind, so we can prevent breaking builds, and we realize this concept of continuous interoperability. So obviously testing is important. A lot of aspects around testing, though, we have to be kind of familiar with in terms of what are the challenges that we might have. So interoperability challenge, if you take a look at what we mean by interoperability, really it's an implementation of the specification where we want to make sure that all the implementations work together. But a lot of times what happens? An implementation is based on interpretation. So if the specification has shoulds and mays and so forth, there's some things that might be left open to interpretation. So we have to be careful about that. And so it's important for us to make sure that we can cycle back to the specification authors, make sure that we understand what is their real intent. And the best way of doing that is through testing. If you can test the specification, features of the specification, and then have everyone go through that process of testing, we can ensure that they're going to be implementing it the same way. Another challenge we have is testing partners. A lot of times when you're building an application, building your implementation, you're kind of in your own little sandbox. And so we want to reach out and potentially have an environment where we could have a partner to test with, but not just any old partner. Think about if I'm going to ask, an associated organization where they have an implementation. I'd like to be able to say, well, can I test when your system doesn't behave right? So negative testing is important as well too. How often do you think your partner is going to say, oh yeah, let me break my application for you so that you can test out how you're going to behave if something goes wrong? So that's why testing platforms where we can do that type of negative testing become very important. So a very common misconception in this is that two systems interacting equals interoperability. System A and B can talk to each other, no problems. What happens when system 3, 4, 10, 100, 1,000, right? What happens when all these other systems start talking together? So successful testing, multifaceted, and encompasses real-world conditions. That's an important aspect as well too. We don't want to just leave it, unit testing and so forth. That integration testing and then getting up into real production level testing is important as well too. So we've got the 5 W's of testing that I like to go through. So these are our, why, who, what, when, and so forth. So the why do we test? Well, ultimately, we want better outcomes, and we want to be able to do our implementations in a faster, more efficient mechanism. So that's what we mean by that. Also, continuous interoperability. What does that mean? Well, it means as the specifications evolve and change, we want to keep abreast of those. And so we don't want to just test once and be done. We want to be able to have an environment where we can come back and keep retesting where appropriate as those tests evolve, as the spec evolves, and so forth. Now, also certification. here in the US, as I mentioned, we have a couple programs that are going on. CMS, Interoperability and Patient Access Final Rule Guidelines, okay? So we'll talk about that program in a little bit towards the end. Also, ONC's Final Rule Guidance for the 21st Century Cures Act, which really talks to that G10 certification that I mentioned before. And these are a couple little excerpts from that ONC guidance on their final rule, and just kind of pointing out what have they mandated. The use of HL7 FHIR as an API, specifically R4 4.0.1. Also, real-world testing has to be part of what's going to happen for your certification. So you have to prove to ONC that you successfully have done real-world testing of your technology. Who should test? Well, anybody building an application or implementation, really. So if you're a software vendor implementer and you're trying to meet some of these requirements, the certification requirements, obviously you're going to be coding and implementing to that. But beyond that, any software vendor or implementer who is going to be conformant or wants to be conformant to the FHIR specification, implementation guides, and so forth. And then the implementation guide authors themselves need to do testing. Now, fortunately, a lot of the tooling that we have, the IG publisher and so forth, have built-in validation to them. So as you build your IGs, a lot of that validation process goes on. But even so, you need to make sure that example resources that you're building and so on and so forth match the use cases that you want and are conformant, so they are examples that people can use going forward. What should we test? Well, there's that word again, interoperability. But that means system conformance to the specification. We want to validate those resources, profiles, implementation guides. We want to validate the use of the API itself. So it's not just about running the validation engine, right, and making sure that the resource instance I have is conformant. It's the whole spec, which means that RESTful API. When I do a create operation, I need to send content type header. I need to do a bunch of other things. I need to be conformant, not just at a resource level, but at the whole API as well. Again, implementation guides, we want to make sure that when we're building them, we verify them against the FHIR standards, make sure their examples are conformant and appropriate for the IG. And there's that word again, certification. So a little bit of repetition here, but you get the idea. A lot of this all just kind of comes together. When should we test? Our mantra, test early, test often. During development, obviously that's what we're talking about here, testing during development, but not just then, the whole life cycle, integration testing and unit testing, post-production, whatever it might be. You need to be out there testing as often as you can, because there is a return on investment in doing so, and that's mitigating and reducing the cost of having to fix it later. As part of your initial or annual certification process, connect-a-thon events. This is a big one for FHIR, right? Because part of the FHIR specification is that you cannot mature the FHIR spec unless you go through connect-a-thons. But it's not just during the connect-a-thon, before the connect-a-thon, after the connect-a-thon. We need to be in that mode of preparing for, doing testing, follow up, go back again, prepare for the next round, and so forth. So we have to be able to have an environment where we can do that, not just during the events themselves. And of course, as IGs and profiles are being built and so forth. And then where can we test? Well, as I said, I work for Aegis. We have a platform called Touchstone. So if you go to touchstone.com, you'll bring up the landing page for our testing environment. But beyond that, there are other tools available, and you've probably heard of them or actually used them already. The MITRE organization has Crucible, which is kind of equivalent to our Touchstone. They do server testing, but they also have Inferno. And Inferno is currently being used by the ONC for their G10 certification. Additionally, if you go to the HL7 Confluence site, there's a page for publicly available test servers and clients, a few of them. But this is a great place to go if you're just looking for a partner, right? An open source or openly available partner that implements hopefully most, if not all, of the FHIR specification. Read through very carefully and see what those servers do. They're being maintained by organizations for your use in an open fashion, right? So they're functionality and their support will vary. But also, interestingly enough, there's another page on testing platforms, which you'll find the link to Touchstone, to Crucible, to Inferno. Also, there's another site, NIST, another organization, NIST, National Institutes of Standards Technology. They've got a tool which uses test script for FHIR called Asbestos, and you can go to the GitHub site and download it, primarily used in relation to IHE testing as well. But go there. It's a short list, but hopefully we can start to grow that list as time goes on. So talking about testing, FHIR as a specification I love because it has built into it the definition of a testing framework. So ever since DSTU2 of FHIR, there has been this definition of a FHIR testing framework. And so taken from that initial page, it's there to ensure interoperability between applications claiming conformance to the FHIR spec. So that's why it's been established. Now, Touchstone, we follow the FHIR specification. Inferno also does great testing, but they've gone a different route. But they're coming back and they're actually looking at incorporating support for test script into Inferno as well at this point. So I know there's ongoing work. So you can talk to the MITRE folk who are here to learn more about that. But the testing framework has two very key components. What's called a FHIR test engine, and that engine is how we execute the test and gather results so that we can present them to the user to see how they're doing. Remember that little sunburst you wear? So I'm just taking the results and I'm just making them more pretty so that you can actually get a nice view of conformance. But however you want to represent the results, that's up to you if you're building your test platform. And then, of course, this test definition. So there's a first-class resource type in FHIR called test script. And again, since DSTU2, this thing has been around. It's gone through ballot cycles and so forth. So, but what does it represent? Well, a natural language computable format of a test case. Think about, I want to do a workflow, let's say. And I want to do a create followed by a read with an update. And you can think of other IGs if you want to get into prior auth with DaVinci or so on and so forth. There's various operations that need to be executed, and then you have to actually assert what success is. So based on that operation, you then have a series of conditions that evaluate to true or false to evaluate the success or failure of that operation. And so when we think of the test script resource, right, it's an executable test definition where I can gather the results to examine the outcomes. Now, an example of this would be something like a test script that has a series of tests within it that might test patient search. Okay, so I might have variations of patient search. I might be doing US core validation where they actually tell you what search parameters you have to support, whatever it might be. Well, what do I need to support that level of testing? Well, sure, I need a test script, but I need test data. So I have to have a suite of data, in this case, perhaps a range of patient resources that match the criteria for the searching that I want to test. And I'll have some that match, some that don't. I want to exercise the operation of search on that FHIR server. And then we get into the actual test script itself. And within the test script definition, you've got this concept of a setup. Well, all that test data needs to be set up, perhaps, created in the system under test. And so that's the purpose of the setup, is to establish that test data. If your server doesn't support create operation or update, it's just more of a read-only, you'll have to have some other mechanism to take that data and pre-populate it into your environment. But the idea is if you do, test scripts can support that as part of the pre-processing, if you will. And then a series of tests that'll be executed, evaluated, and then finally an optional teardown, cleanup, if you will, to bring the system under test back to a known stable state. Kind of like a JUnit test. Anybody know JUnits? Okay, you got a before, you got an after, same concept, right? So that's just a quick flyby of the testing platform within FHIR. The FHIR testing programs at scale that I mentioned before, we have two of them. The first one is, as I said, that ONC G10 certification program, powered by Inferno from MITRE. And if you want to follow the link that you see there, that's going to take you to the Inferno site for the G10 testing. And so basically you're going to get this lovely dashboard interface where you can start up a new session, pick and choose the groupings of tests that you want to run through. Again, the MITRE folk are here, so if you're interested in Inferno, please go to them for more information. They have a chat on the Zulip chat. They've got an Inferno stream, so again, go there for any issues or any questions that you might have. The other program that we have through Drummond is a voluntary program for you to be, for your organization's system to become certified according to the CMS guidelines. In this case, it's powered by Touchstone, so we partnered with Drummond in this case to provide those tests and give those test results to Drummond for their certification or seals of approval, if you will. So this is just a listing of some of the APIs that are covered right now by that Drummond certification program: patient, provider, provider directory, documentation requirements, prior auth, bulk data. All of those translate into various implementation guides, most of them from the DaVinci Accelerator program, but you also have one from Karen, which is typically referred to as Karen for Blue Button, as well as the US core, which kind of underpins all of these things, as well as the FHIR bulk data or flat FHIR specification. So all of this is supported in the Drummond certification program. So the process for this certification is, as an organization, you want to bring a system through certification based on which API you're interested in. So you register with Drummond, they will take you through some of the pre-test support, and then once you're in, basically you now have access through Touchstone to all of these test definitions where you can start playing around with them. You're not going to jump right into certification. You want to be able to execute these tests before you get there so you can understand, oh, I have a gap here that I need to start working on. And so this is your testing during development cycle that you're going to be working on. And once you've achieved your independent success before certification, you then say, hey, I'm ready, raise your hand, and you let Drummond know, and now they'll schedule a monitoring session for you to run through your certification run, if you will. And then once you complete that, they'll take the results, examine them. Sometimes there's some manual examination that has to occur, but then they'll review and grant you your badge or seal of certificate, whatever it might be, after they've done their review. You're not done, right? What did we say? We want continuous interoperability, because we're going to come around again probably next year for a recertification. So the platform is open 24/7. So as an organization, you now have access to those tests and you can continue testing, especially since the IGs are under development, right? So some of those IGs are STUs, trial use. They're not quite normative yet. So we may be running into a new version of an IG. And so the tests will be updated and made available to you. You're in the program, right? And so you're encouraged to continue your testing even after the fact to keep up to date with any changes that might occur. So when you come around again, your pre-test support is a breeze. You just drop right back down into the testing support that you needed, and then off you go again. So it's a really nice program, a nice way to illustrate that test-driven or testing during development type of cycle that we want you to get into. Okay, I've been talking for what, 25, 30 minutes maybe, give or take? Lynn's kind of shaking her head there. Let's go take a look at my conformance suite results. Let's go back into Touchstone and let's just refresh the page. There we go. Whoops, let's scroll up a little bit. Okay, so I've improved, haven't I? So that all happened in the background, right? I didn't have to worry about monitoring continuously. I could just let it go and then come back and review the results. And so that's kind of the benefit of having this type of environment. Just let it go. And I've just ran through 2,282 tests across probably 180 test scripts. And so, I can go in and I can drill down into the results. And we have various dashboards that you can drill down and look into the actual processes. And I said, this is kind of like a little workflow that's going on here. So you can keep drilling down and looking at the details And so I mentioned there's an operation, and then there's asserts that follow. So as long as I'm getting green check marks, right, I'm passing. In some case, you might have a conditional assert. So the conditional assert means if the conditions for this test are matched, I'll run it, but if not, I'll skip it. And so sometimes you might see a little skip in orange there, in those particular cases. So I might have the expectation of 2 different resource types that might come back from the create. Remember, the create operation doesn't always mean you have to send back what was created. I could send back an operation outcome. So I have to allow for some conditionality in the spec as well, too, in my test definitions. And so that's the thing that we're doing here. Okay, so yay, I've done a pretty good job. Now I can, kind of flip back to a high-level test execution, right? I could even execute again at an individual test script level if I wanted to, or the whole suite if I wanted to, so I could re-execute things. And if I did have some failures, these boxes that you see here are actually filters. So how many failures did I have? If I click on failures, then, well, I can't really because there's no failure. So you get the idea though. All right. So quick whirlwind tour of testing during development and then continuously, where you can take advantage of tests that have already been built. And I mean, I showed you Touchstone, but Inferno and other tooling as well, there's thousands of tests that have already been pre-built that you can run through, whether it's on your own or in conjunction with a program like Drummond. When you perform validation testing, understand there are challenges involved. The 5 W's of testing, why, who, what, when, where. And then FHIR itself has a testing framework. And so we encourage other organizations who want to develop testing engines to follow that framework. At-scale testing programs, ONC, G10 certification, currently supported by Inferno. We, Aegis, are waiting for our final approval to also be another testing platform for G10 through Drummond. Hopefully we'll be hearing that relatively soon. But then the other Drummond certification programs that you find for the CMS guidelines and those various APIs that you saw. So where do we go from here? Well, obviously we want to incorporate testing into our implementation guides. I've had various conversations here at DevDays and even at some of the Connectathons that we've recently had in our FHIR testing and test script Connectathon track, where we want to make the idea of defining testing a little bit easier and incorporate that into the implementation guide itself in a more formal way. And so we're looking at how we can leverage like the FHIR shorthand to start generating test scripts so that you don't have to slog through all the XML or JSON. Because if you look at a test script, it can be pretty verbose and pretty intimidating. But if we can simplify that process using FHIR shorthand, that's going to make the bar for entry a little bit lower, a little bit easier for people to get into defining those tests. So we want to update our tooling to incorporate that. So the IG publication tooling, which currently uses those fish templates for the IGs, we can go into there and we can actually incorporate that into them quite easily. And that's actually, I'm working with, was anybody here for Mark Kramer, Chris Mosel yesterday for the fish presentation? Okay, well, I'm working with Mark now and we're looking to do that. So that's actually on my agenda now to start getting that incorporated. We want to engage with more organizations, programs to incorporate testing, and we want to keep FHIR testing as an ongoing discussion. It's important to us and we think it should be important to everybody. And I have a Let's Build session right after this where I'm going to be running through some scenarios that illustrate test-driven development, testing during development, using test scripts with our Aegis Touchstone platform. So if you're interested, please stick around for that. Now, I'd like to just close out with a quote from our own Mario Highland, our Aegis Interop guy. Thank you, Mario, for the cookies, by the way. So if you haven't got a cookie, there's cookies in the back. So we are not testing simply for today, meaning the IG or version of the standard we're working with today. That's too limiting a view. Rather, we're preparing our testing approaches and testing infrastructure for the future when our FHIR community is significantly more complex. And it is getting more complex every day. How many implementation guides are out there now? Anybody remember what Graham said? 700 something. I mean, if you just look at the HL7 registry, there's 165 just there. I mean, 700? Wow. And it's just going to keep growing. So, you know, it's something that we really have to address, I think. So during the event, I'm available in the speakers gallery via the Whova app, email address, LinkedIn account. My Twitter handle is Technoman. I did not choose that, my family did. That's my superhero name in my family. So that's where that came from, if you're curious. And if you're interested in more information about the Drummond certification programs, you can go to drummondgroup.com, and you can also take a look at our sites, the aegis.net/touchstone, to learn more about the Touchstone platform, or stick around for Let's Build, and I'll actually show you a few more things. So, how we doing on time? Okay, so questions, Q&A time. Yes.
Thanks, I really enjoyed your presentation. If I look at the Touchstone suite, or you look at the Touchstone suite, would you characterize it as like a superset of Inferno and Crucible and adding additional tests, or how would you characterize it?
Well, so our intent, so basically I can go to our test definitions here, and this basically will show you and by the way, you're looking at the test scripts I have ready for Let's Build right there. But we have basically a lot of test scripts that we've written over the years since we started about 2015 was version 1 of Touchstone. Connectathon 10 is when we introduced it. But basically, the Inferno tests are for the ONC G10 certification, right? And so from ONC, they have all their test cases. So we've created the same test cases now in our environment. Beyond that, we have support for other programs. Now I'm logged in as, you know, an account that can't see everything. So we have permissions that are in Touchstone that allow access based on when you join a program, you're put into an organization group that, you know, we open things up for you. So I'm showing basically a small subset of the tests that we have. So as I said, those basic tests that I showed you, we've got a whole suite of what I call my basic test scripts. Per resource type, we just run through create, read, update, version read, you know, history, you know, search and delete. You know, so basically it's a nice little workflow that cleans up after itself. So whatever I created at the beginning, I delete at the end, and then move on from there. So we have suites of test scripts above and beyond, but also including the ones for the ONC G10 certification. So hopefully that makes sense and answers the question. Anything else?
So I had a question about what do you do in cases where you need user interaction? So there's an app. Yeah, what do you do in that situation?
So, follow-on question? Or?
Yeah, just the strategy you have. Like, what's the strategy? Because it's really easy to do. Not easy, but it's great to do testing where you can just send stuff to the server, get the responses back. But what about when the user has to initiate action or has to take action in the process?
Yeah, so if you look at the structure of test script, in order to manage that test data, we have what are called variables. And so variables are basically just, you do a path expression into whether it might be a static fixture as we call it, or to a result coming back from an operation. So that's basically just pulling a piece of data out that I can use again later. But as you said, what if I want to alter the test execution with my own data that I inject into the test? And that's what we call a dynamic variable. It's part of the specification. So your test engine needs to allow for a test script that has this dynamic variable definition and then provide a mechanism to the user to input that data. Now in our case, see if I can actually give you an example. So in our training material for Touchstone, we've got a lot of different things here. So I'm just have to remember. So FHIR path, rule sets. Bear with me a minute here. Client read, client create. So if we're going to do like a peer-to-peer type of test. So let's just grab this. I left my mouse at home, so I have to use the touchpad. So bear with me here. So I'm going to create a test setup. Now, what I'm doing here is this is just our UI for taking a given test script or group of test scripts and then providing the interface to launch or execute them. And so here, I can see that I can choose an origin. There's two actors, right? There's a client and a server. In this case, Touchstone is going to take the role of the client. And so that's my default client that you see up there. The server is going to be the system under test. In this case, my wildfire server, okay? My wildfire R4. Down below here, this is a read operation, but I don't want to just hard code the resource ID for the patient that I want to read because I don't know what's on your server. So I give the user the ability to enter a resource ID, and this is what we mean by a dynamic variable. And so I know that my wildfire server has all of the default test data from the FHIR specification, and there's a patient with an ID of example, Peter Chalmers, okay? If I knew something else, I could come in here and I could just replace this. So as a default value, I've already given you example, as the default value, but this is going to be the dynamic value. So if I decided to put in something, X, Y, Z, Z, Y, I have no idea if that exists, right? Probably not, unless somebody has created it on my server. So if I execute this with an ID that doesn't exist, what's going to happen? It's going to fail. Red is okay. It just means we have to go examine what happened, right? So if I drill down into the test, I can see that my server sent back a 404, not found. Now, if I had written this test to expect a 404, I could have passed the test with an invalid resource ID. But here I'm expecting a valid ID and a 200 response, and so I fail, okay? But that's the idea. You can actually see there's patient XY, let's see, hang on. We give you all the details about what just happened here. So you can see, right, here's the actual URL with patient XYZZY, right, as I would expect.
I have a question from the virtual audience. They ask, how useful would the Touchstone suite be for the European continent, i.e. to what degree is it specified to the US and ONC?
Well, as I said, we work with various programs, and I've just given an example of a couple of them here in the US. We actually have programs that we support in Europe already today. NICDIS in the Netherlands uses us quite heavily for their MedMy program that they have. Medcom in Denmark, right, for their DK profiles that they're currently working on. Ontario Health up in Canada uses us as well too. So we're not US specific or anything of that nature. What we do is, based on programs that we get integrated into, we develop the test suites that are needed for that particular program. So, yes.
There are additional questions. There's a question regarding incorporating test script into IGs.
Mm-hmm.
Is the intent for the IG publisher to process these test scripts in the same way a test engine would?
No. So the test engine is going to execute the test scripts. These are the test definitions. Okay, so basically, think about your implementation guide, and I actually had a link to an IG here that I wanted to point out. Hang on a second. I go back. So let's take as an example the DaVinci CDEX IG. If I were to drill down into this, and I chose this particular page in the IG because the direct query, right, discovery of patient FHIR IDs, they've got scenarios here. Scenario 1, scenario 2. Now you look at these and you go, oh, those are my tests, aren't they? No, they're not really written as a full-blown test. So what we're talking about here is not only incorporating the idea of being able to generate test scripts, but before you can even generate a test script, you have to have a test case. You have to define what the thing is that you're testing. And then in the IG, you want to have areas like this in the IG that incorporate a format that says, okay, here is not just a scenario, this is my test scenario. This is the operation that you're going to perform, or operations, and this is the behavior, the conditions by which I'm going to say that was successful. And so we want to incorporate that into the IG in a known format so that people can follow that for definitions of the tests. But then we want to take those and relate them to the generation of test scripts. What I'm doing right now is I'm kind of working from the bottom. Since I know test script pretty well, I'm going to work on the tooling that needs to be done to generate the test scripts using FHIR, FHIR shorthand. And then Mark Kramer is going to probably work from the other end and start thinking about this part of the equation. And then hopefully we're going to meet in the middle somewhere, so that right, so that we can take from this definition and look to generate test scripts. And then the test engine is going to execute those test scripts.
If I can, oh, sorry.
We got another one over here.
Thanks. Is it possible to test a FHIR server that lies behind a firewall? Let's say it's an on-prem FHIR server.
So the way that we operate today with Touchstone is, this is what we call testing as a service. And so it's in a cloud-based environment. And so in order for us to test a FHIR server, we need to be able to access it publicly. So it has to have a resolvable reference, have a public IP address, and so forth. Now, if you're interested in doing some testing behind a firewall, we've been entertaining the idea of providing Touchstone as a service behind your firewall. But that's going to be something that will probably come in a future iteration of the tooling that we have right now. We have enough to keep us busy at the moment. But it's certainly something that we've been considering for some time that we'd like to incorporate. So if we could Dockerize the environment. You have to remember though, Touchstone as a platform is not just one application. What I'm showing you in the web application, the user interface, is just the front end. We have validation services, we have test systems behind the scenes, access to terminology servers. So there's a whole infrastructure supporting Touchstone. So think about Dockerizing that and putting it behind somebody's firewall. You're going to have to provide an infrastructure in your environment to support that. So, but yeah, it is certainly something we want to consider. Yes.
Thanks for the great presentation. Question about some scenarios require multiple servers, like peer-to-peer and that sort of thing. So how does that work in your framework?
So test script is designed to support multi-actors. So as I showed you in the test setup, that particular test script defined two actors, a client and a server. Well, all I have to do is go into the test script definition and define a second client or a second server or a third. They're given indexes, assigned indexes, and then basically in the operation is between two actors, right? So I want client 2 to destination server 1, and then I'll do some testing, and then I set it up to go, okay, Touchstone will act as my default client just to do some quick little read to test something, and then I'll move on to the next step, and I'll choose different actors that are going to be involved there. So when we start talking about peer-to-peer type of testing, what Touchstone will do is it will not, if it's not the client, then it will sit and wait. Okay, and so it goes into a waiting status, waiting for that particular request of whatever operation it was from whatever client registered in Touchstone, waiting to, it's listening. It's on that thread, just listening. Okay, it'll time out after a couple of hours if it doesn't get anything. But then as soon as it gets that request inbound from that client from a known IP address, it's got to be the correct HTTP operation. If you're doing a create, you better do a post, right? Or if you're doing an update, it better be a put. So even though I'm getting a message from that client, if it doesn't match the expected operation, it's not going to match it up. So there's some smarts in there from a proxy perspective, listening and then directing it on to the appropriate destination. So the test script as a definition accounts for that.
One last question from
Sure.
the virtual attendees. Do you take the server's capability statement to decide what tests to run?
Good question. We actually take a slightly different approach with that. So if we go into Touchstone, okay, and hang on a second. Let me go back to that conformance suite and let me turn off the volume here so I can navigate a little bit easier. So if we go back to our suite, what we do is we provide this filtering capability based on the capability statement. Our philosophy is we don't want to stop you from running a test just because your capability statement doesn't say you support something, okay? Because this is a development environment, right? So your system might be under development and you just haven't updated your capability statement yet. So we're not going to restrict you from running tests, but for something like a conformance report, this is where we want to incorporate your capability statement and match it up to the tests that you've executed, and we'll filter out any tests that have operations that you say you don't support. So imagine I had some red showing up here, okay? Well, those might be tests for operations that I don't support. So if I click on this little checkbox here, I'm going to take my capability statement into account. Now, it just so happens my wildfire capability statement states I don't support 4 resource types. I was anticipating this. So the idea here is that I can filter away results that I don't support. And so now my conformance result, my conformance number, will accurately reflect the tests I've executed and what I say I support. So that's the approach that we've taken.
Thank you very much, Richard. And thank you to our in-present and virtual attendees. Appreciate your time and your attention, and have a great day.
All right.